Did you ever wonder how people learned anything before Google, before textbooks, even before most folks could read? Picture a world where knowledge wasn't just written on pages, but painted on walls, carved in stone and glowing in stained glass. For 1,000 years, roughly from 500 CE to 1500 CE, medieval art wasn't just pretty to look at. It was a secret classroom, a visual encyclopedia, and a moral compass all rolled into one. Get ready to uncover the surprising ways art taught an entire civilization. Number 1. Cosmology and the divine order of the universe. The medieval mind often saw the entire universe as a carefully crafted testament to God's ultimate plan. Art became a powerful tool to illustrate this grand cosmic vision, helping people grasp their place in a divinely ordered world. People in the Middle Ages might not have had spacecraft or telescopes, but they had intricate artworks explaining the heavens and the earth. These visual representations were not just decoration. They were serious lessons in how the world was believed to function, from its creation to its ultimate destiny. Consider the enormous Mappa Mundi in Hereford Cathedral, England, created around 1300 CE. This isn't a map like the ones we use today, showing precise geographical coordinates. It's a vast, circular drawing on a single sheet of vellum, measuring over 5 feet across. The map places Jerusalem at its very center, a spiritual axis for the entire world. East, where the sun rises and where Christ was believed to originate, is at the top. The Mappa Mundi depicts rivers and seas, mountains and cities, but also fantastical creatures like griffins and unicorns, and the mythical tribes of Gog and Magog. It shows scenes from biblical history, such as the Garden of Eden and Noah's Ark, and the Last Judgment. For a medieval viewer, this map was a cosmic diagram. It taught about the known world, its biblical origins, and its eschatological future. The map conveyed that the world was ordered by divine will, with sacred history unfolding upon its surface. It was a visual sermon about humanity's journey from paradise lost to ultimate judgment. Another way art taught cosmology was through depictions of the celestial spheres. Medieval astronomy, largely based on the Ptolemaic system, believed the Earth was the center of the universe, surrounded by concentric crystalline spheres, each carrying a planet, the sun, or the moon, and finally the fixed stars. Illuminated manuscripts often featured detailed diagrams of these spheres, sometimes with personifications of the planets or zodiac signs. A manuscript, like the Disfera from the Sforza Library, created in the late 15th century, shows vivid illustrations of these planetary spheres. The images communicate the complex interplay of heavenly bodies and their supposed influence on earthly life. People learned about the hierarchy of the cosmos, the journey of light from the outer spheres to Earth, and the order that governed all existence. The meticulous rendering of these spheres, often in deep blues and golds, elevated the subject to something truly sublime, reinforcing the idea of a perfect divine creation. Creation narratives themselves were frequent subjects for educational art. The vast sculptures on the portals of cathedrals or the intricate stained glass windows often began with the story of Genesis. At the west portal of Chartres Cathedral, France, dating from the mid-12th century, the archivolts above the central door show scenes from the creation story. Viewers would see the creation of Adam and Eve, God resting on the seventh day, and the expulsion from the Garden of Eden. These visual narratives provided a foundational understanding of the universe's origin according to Christian doctrine. For people who could not read the Latin Bible, these stone books were crucial. They learned that the world was created intentionally, that humanity had a special place within it, and that a divine plan was unfolding through history. Each figure, each detail, served to reinforce theological truths about the universe's beginnings. Similarly, Apocalyptic scenes depicting the end times and the Last Judgment served as powerful cosmological lessons. They presented the ultimate culmination of the divine plan. The Apocalypse tapestry in Angers, France, woven in the late 14th century, is an extraordinary example. This monumental work, originally over 100 meters long, depicts scenes from the Book of Revelation. It shows angels sounding trumpets, the beast of the sea, the whore of Babylon, and the New Jerusalem descending from heaven. Tapestry served as a stark visual reminder of the final judgment and the ultimate restoration of divine order. Viewers learned about the cosmic struggle between good and evil, the destruction of the old world, and the promise of a new heaven and earth. The sheer scale and dramatic imagery of such works made an indelible impression, solidifying a particular understanding of the universe's trajectory from creation to eternity. Art that depicted the cosmic man, or the zodiac man, also taught about the perceived connection between humanity and the cosmos. These illustrations, often found in medical or astrological manuscripts, showed a human figure with lines connecting different parts of the body to specific zodiac signs or planets. For instance, the head might be linked to Aries, the neck to Taurus, and so forth. This was a medieval way of understanding humoral medicine and astrology. The diagrams taught that human health and destiny were intimately tied to celestial movements. A medieval person consulting such a diagram learned that their own body was a microcosm reflecting the macrocosm of the universe. This reinforced the idea of a deeply interconnected and ordered universe, where everything from the smallest human ailment to the grandest celestial event was part of a single unified divine system. These visual aids were vital for imparting a holistic understanding of the cosmos and humanity's place within it. Number 2. Pilgrimage and saint veneration. Pilgrimages were a central part of medieval religious life. People embarked on arduous journeys to holy sites seeking spiritual merit, miraculous cures, or penance for sins. Art played a crucial role in supporting these spiritual quests, serving as visual guides, inspiring devotion and teaching pilgrims about the saints they sought to honor. These artworks were not just decoration, they were guidebooks, testimonials, and emotional anchors for the devout traveler. They taught about the lives and miracles of saints, the sacred geography of pilgrimage routes, and the very act of seeking divine intervention. The great pilgrimage churches along routes like the Way of St. James to Santiago de Compostela in Spain were bursting with art designed for pilgrims. The tympana above the main entrance doors were particularly important. At the Basilica of St. Sernin in Toulouse, France, a major stop on the Way of St. James, the portal sculptures from the late 11th and early 12th centuries depicted Christ in majesty, surrounded by symbols of the evangelists. Below, apostles and saints, including St. James himself, are depicted. These sculptures taught pilgrims about the sacred figures awaiting them inside and the divine majesty associated with the holy site. They served as a visual welcome and a spiritual orientation, immediately immersing the pilgrim in the sacred narrative of the place. The detailed carving and prominent placement ensured that even fatigued travelers could grasp the central message and the importance of the saints. Inside pilgrimage churches, chapels dedicated to specific saints would often feature altarpieces or frescoes, illustrating their lives and miracles. For example, at the Church of Sainte Foy in Conques, France, another important pilgrimage stop, the elaborate tympanum over the west portal depicts the Last Judgment. While not solely about Sainte Foy, it places her among the blessed. Inside, pilgrims would encounter the magnificent golden reliquary statue of Sainte Foy, a young martyr. This stunning object, adorned with jewels, contained the saint's skull. The very presence of such a richly adorned reliquary taught pilgrims about the preciousness of saints' relics and the power believed to emanate from them. The visual splendor underscored the saint's importance and encouraged veneration, acting as a focal point for prayer and devotion. Pilgrims learned that by being in the physical presence of the relic, they were closer to the saint, and through them to God. Manuscripts containing vitae, or lives of the saints, were also crucial educational tools, though perhaps for a more literate audience or for reading aloud to groups. These texts were often richly illuminated with scenes from the saints' birth, their acts of piety, their martyrdom, and their posthumous miracles. The Golden Legend, compiled by Jacobus de Voragine in the 13th century, was one of the most popular books of the Middle Ages. It provided biographies of numerous saints, feast days, and associated narratives. Copies of this work, often with vibrant illustrations, taught people about the virtues exemplified by saints, the challenges they faced, and the divine rewards they received. Paintings showing St. Catherine arguing with pagan philosophers, or St. George slaying the dragon, instilled lessons of courage, faith, and divine protection. These images communicated that saints were not just historical figures, but living examples of faith and intercessors with God. Pilgrimage badges, though small, also served an educational purpose. These little lead or tin souvenirs bought at holy sites and pinned to clothing or hats often depicted the saint associated with the shrine or a symbolic image of the place. A scallop shell, for example, was the symbol of St. James and Santiago de Compostela. Wearing these badges taught others about the wearer's spiritual journey and devotion. For the wearer, it was a constant visual reminder of their pilgrimage vows and the spiritual benefits gained. The images on the badges were simple but recognizable, making them effective teaching tools for widespread recognition of holy figures and sites. These small artworks acted as miniature educational signposts, broadcasting religious affiliation and experience. Finally, maps of pilgrimage routes themselves, sometimes found in manuscripts, combined geographical information with spiritual guidance. These maps might highlight churches, monasteries, and hospices along the way, helping pilgrims plan their arduous journeys. A detailed map could show the order of towns and the specific saints or relics to be found at each stop. While not strictly art in the monumental sense, the diagrams and illustrations within these maps served an educational function. They taught practical knowledge for undertaking a pilgrimage, reinforcing the idea that the journey itself was a sacred act. These visual aids made the daunting task of travel more manageable and more spiritually meaningful, ensuring that pilgrims arrived at their desired holy destinations informed and prepared. Number 3. Social order and political allegiance. Medieval society was highly stratified with clear hierarchies of power and responsibility. Art played a significant role in visually reinforcing this social order, legitimizing rulers and instructing people on their place within the divine and earthly structure. These artworks were not just beautiful, they were powerful statements about who held authority, who owed obedience, and how society was supposed to function. They taught people about their roles, their duties, and the divine sanction behind the established order. One of the most striking examples of art teaching social hierarchy is the frequent depiction of the 3 orders of society: those who pray, the clergy; those who fight, the nobility; and those who work, the peasantry. These representations could be found in illuminated manuscripts, on carved misericords, in choir stalls, or even in large-scale frescoes. A manuscript illustration might show a monk at prayer, a knight in armor, and a peasant tilling the soil, each figure clearly delineated in their respective roles. This visual typology taught viewers that society was divinely ordained to be structured this way. Each group had a specific function, and together they formed a harmonious whole. People learned that this division was natural and beneficial, ensuring stability and order in a world often prone to chaos. It reinforced the idea that one's birth determined one's place, and that this was part of God's plan. Art was also crucial for legitimizing the rule of kings and queens. Royal portraits, often found in illuminated chronicles, or as monumental effigies on tombs, depicted rulers in majestic poses, wearing crowns, and holding symbols of power like scepters and orbs. Tomb of Edward the Confessor in Westminster Abbey, for instance, or the effigies of French kings at St. Denis Basilica, presented a powerful visual narrative of continuous royal lineage and divinely appointed authority. These sculptures were not merely memorials. They were permanent public declarations of legitimacy. Viewers learned about the unbroken chain of succession and the sacred nature of kingship. The depiction of rulers as strong, pious, and just, figures instilled respect and loyalty, teaching subjects that their allegiance was due to these divinely chosen leaders. Civic art, particularly in the later Middle Ages, also taught about political allegiance and community values. In Italian city-states, for example, frescoes and communal palaces conveyed powerful messages about good governance and its benefits. Ambrogio Lorenzetti's allegory of good and bad government in the Palazzo Pubblico in Siena, painted in the 1330s, is a monumental example. The fresco cycle is divided into several scenes. The allegory of good government on one wall shows a personification of justice, with citizens living harmoniously under a benevolent ruler, enjoying prosperity and peace. On another wall, the effects of good government depicts a flourishing city and a secure countryside, with bustling trade, dancing, and building. The allegory of bad government and its effects show tyranny, fear, and ruin. This extensive work of art was a direct educational tool for the city's magistrates and citizens. It taught them the virtues necessary for good governance, the dangers of injustice and corruption, and the direct impact of leadership on daily life. Citizens learned what was expected of them in contributing to civic peace and what the consequences of societal breakdown could be. Heraldry, a system of hereditary symbols used by noble families, was another widespread visual language that taught social and political identity. Coats of arms were displayed on shields, banners, tapestries, and even architectural elements. Each design was unique to a family or lord, and recognizing these symbols was a common form of visual literacy. A person could identify a lord's domain, their allies, or their enemies simply by recognizing their heraldic device. This system taught about lineage, fealty, and military alliances. It helped people understand who was who in the complex web of feudal relationships. Prominent display of a lord's arms on his castle or in his hall constantly reminded his vassals and subjects of his authority and their allegiance. Finally, depictions of coronations, investitures, and other formal ceremonies in chronicles or illuminated manuscripts served to ritualize and legitimize power. Painting, showing a king being anointed by a bishop, or a lord receiving his fealty from a vassal, underscored the sacred and contractual nature of political relationships. These images taught about the solemnity of oaths, the importance of loyalty, and the divine sanction behind all legitimate authority. They were visual records of significant political events, but more importantly, they were constant reminders of the binding ties that held medieval society together. Through these visual narratives, people learned the foundational principles of their social and political existence. Number 4. Liturgical understanding and ritual explanation. For medieval Christians, the liturgy or public worship, especially the Mass, was the heart of their spiritual life. However, much of the Mass was conducted in Latin, a language many people did not understand. Art stepped in to bridge this gap, providing visual explanations of complex theological concepts and the significance of various rituals. These artworks were not merely backdrops for worship. They were active teachers, helping the congregation understand the sacred drama unfolding before them. They taught about the meaning of the sacraments, the sequence of the Mass, and the historical events that underpinned Christian belief. Altarpieces, the multi-panel paintings or sculptures placed behind the altar in churches, were prime examples of this educational function. Many altarpieces depicted scenes from the life of Christ, particularly the Passion narrative leading up to his crucifixion and resurrection. For example, the Isenheim altarpiece by Matthias Grunewald and Nicolaus Hagenauer, created in the early 16th century for a hospital in Colmar, France, is a powerful and graphic depiction of Christ's suffering. When closed, it shows the crucifixion, the entombment, and saints associated with healing. When opened, it reveals scenes of the Annunciation, the Nativity, and the Resurrection. For the sick and dying patients in the hospital, this altarpiece offered a profound visual meditation on Christ's sacrifice and ultimate triumph over death, taught them about suffering and redemption, making the abstract concept of salvation tangible and personal. Connected their own physical pain to the divine suffering of Christ, offering comfort and hope. Stained glass windows also played a massive role in explaining liturgical seasons and the order of worship. Many cathedrals featured cycles of windows, depicting biblical events that corresponded to the liturgical calendar. Passion window or Tree of Jesse window at Chartres Cathedral, France, from the 13th century, tells the story of Christ's lineage and suffering through vibrant, glowing images. As sunlight streamed through these windows, bathing the interior of the church in colored light, the stories literally illuminated the sacred space. Parishioners learned about the prophecies leading to Christ's birth, the events of his life, and the meaning of Easter and Christmas, simply by looking up. These windows served as vast, unrolling picture books, each panel offering a glimpse into sacred history and connecting it to the present moment of worship. The visual narrative reinforced the readings and sermons, making the entire liturgical experience more comprehensible and able. Frescoes on church walls similarly educated the congregation. In parish churches, where altarpieces or stained glass might be less elaborate, wall paintings often depicted scenes from the Mass or the sacraments themselves. Painting might show a priest elevating the host during consecration, or a child being baptized. These images helped parishioners understand the actions performed by the clergy at the altar. They explained the symbolic meaning of the Eucharist, the washing away of sin in baptism, or the spiritual journey of confession. These visual aids demystified the rituals, ensuring that even those without formal education understood the significance of each sacred act. They taught that the liturgy was not just a performance, but a participation in divine mysteries. Liturgical manuscripts, though primarily for clergy, often featured illuminations that further clarified the meaning of the Mass and the sacraments. A missal, used by the priest, might have a miniature painting depicting the Last Supper, or Christ presenting the keys to Peter, a symbol of priestly authority. These images served as visual cues for the priest himself, but also as a teaching aid if shown to lay audiences during instruction. The detailed rendering of vestments, sacred vessels, and specific gestures taught about the proper conduct of rituals and their theological underpinnings. The intricate beauty of these manuscripts reinforced the idea that the liturgy was a sacred and beautiful act worthy of the highest artistic devotion. Finally, the very architecture and layout of churches taught about the liturgical process. The separation of the nave, where the congregation stood, from the chancel, where the altar and clergy were, visually reinforced the hierarchy of worship. Crucifix placed prominently above the altar served as a constant reminder of Christ's sacrifice, the central event commemorated in every Mass. The stained glass and frescoes were strategically placed to guide the eye and attention. The building itself, therefore, was a three-dimensional teaching tool, leading people through the sacred space and through the stages of the liturgy, teaching them about the meaning of their communal worship and their connection to the divine. Number 5. Scientific and natural world knowledge. While medieval science was different from modern science, people in the Middle Ages were deeply curious about the natural world around them. Art played a crucial role in collecting, categorizing, and disseminating this knowledge, albeit often filtered through theological or moral lenses. These artworks were not just curious depictions, they were encyclopedias in visual form teaching about flora, fauna, astronomy, and even the human body. They combined observation with symbolic meaning, helping people understand the world's complexities. Bestiaries were perhaps the most engaging form of art that taught about the natural world. These illuminated manuscripts described various animals, both real and mythical, often assigning them Christian, moral, or theological interpretations. A bestiary might describe a lion, noting its strength and courage, but also likening its 3-day sleep before waking its cubs to Christ's resurrection after 3 days in the tomb. A detailed illustration accompanied each description, teaching the reader what the animal looked like and what symbolic lessons it conveyed. For instance, a pelican piercing its breast to feed its young with its own blood was a common image, teaching about Christ's sacrifice. Other entries might feature exotic animals like elephants, or even mythical creatures like griffins or unicorns, whose existence was generally believed. These depictions talked about the diversity of creation, but also about the hidden spiritual truths embedded in nature. They were fascinating lessons in zoology, morality, and theology all at once. Herbals were another type of illuminated manuscript dedicated to the natural world, specifically plants and their medicinal uses. These books contain detailed drawings of plants, often with accompanying text describing their properties, where they grew, and how they could be prepared to treat various ailments. A careful illustration of a mandrake root, for example, would show its human-like shape, teaching people to recognize it. The text would then explain its reputed properties, from pain relief to inducing sleep. These herbals were vital educational tools for physicians, apothecaries, and even ordinary people in understanding natural remedies. They taught practical knowledge about identifying plants, their specific uses, and how to harness nature for healing. The accuracy of the botanical drawings for their time was often remarkable, demonstrating a keen observational eye aimed at practical application. Astronomical knowledge was also conveyed through art, particularly in calendars, astronomical treatises, and sometimes even in church decoration. Manuscripts often contain diagrams of the heavens, showing the constellations, the phases of the moon, and the movements of the planets, according to the Ptolemaic model. A page from a medieval astronomical text might feature a finely drawn armillary sphere or an intricate chart of planetary positions. These visual aids taught about the cycles of the heavens, the principles of timekeeping, and the astrological influences believed to affect earthly life. They provided a visual framework for understanding the cosmos and its impact on daily existence, from agricultural cycles to personal fortunes. The celestial patterns, meticulously rendered, taught viewers about the vastness and order of the universe. In the later Middle Ages, particularly during the Renaissance, an increasing interest in human anatomy began to emerge. Though still rudimentary by modern standards, some medical manuscripts started to include more detailed anatomical drawings, often in fugitive leaves or lift-the-flap diagrams. These illustrations aimed to teach about the internal structure of the human body. A drawing of a skeleton or muscular system might be accompanied by labels or explanatory text. While such works were primarily for the educated medical elite, they represent a shift towards empirical observation in scientific art. They taught about the complexity and design of the human form, providing a visual basis for understanding physiology and disease. These images were crucial for imparting a new kind of anatomical knowledge that moved beyond ancient texts alone. Finally, Even cathedral sculpture and stained glass could convey elements of natural knowledge. Some cathedrals featured carvings of local flora and fauna, or stained glass panels depicting agricultural labors for each month of the year. These details, while decorative, grounded the spiritual narrative in the everyday natural world. Carving of a specific type of leaf on a capital, for instance, subtly taught about the diversity of plant life. These elements taught about the changing seasons, the bounty of the earth, and the interconnectedness of human life with nature's rhythms, all within a spiritual context. The art of the natural world was a constant reminder of God's abundant creation and the ordered beauty of the terrestrial realm. Number 6. Historical narratives and commemoration. In a world without mass media or widely distributed books, visual art served as a powerful means of recording history, celebrating triumphs, and commemorating important events and figures. These artworks were not merely artistic expressions. They were historical documents, propaganda tools, and enduring memorials. They taught people about their past, their heroes, and the significant moments that shaped their communities and nations. They ensured that history, as understood and desired by the powerful, was seen and remembered by all. The Bayeux Tapestry, dating from the late 11th century, is perhaps the most famous example of art teaching historical narrative. This enormous embroidered cloth, nearly 70 meters long, depicts the events leading up to the Norman conquest of England in 1066 CE, culminating in the Battle of Hastings. It shows Harold Godwinson's embassy to Normandy, the death of King Edward the Confessor, Harold's coronation, William the Conqueror's invasion, and the decisive battle. Tapestry functions like a medieval comic strip, with continuous scenes and accompanying Latin inscriptions explaining the action. For a medieval audience, it was an unparalleled visual history lesson. It taught the Norman perspective of the conquest, emphasizing Harold's perceived oath-breaking and William's legitimate claim. It was likely displayed in a prominent place, allowing many to witness the story of how the Normans came to power. The tapestry was a deliberate act of historical commemoration and political justification. Royal tombs and effigies were another vital form of historical commemoration. Monarchs and powerful nobles were often buried in elaborately carved tombs, adorned with lifelike effigies of the deceased. These sculptures were not just passive memorials. They were active historical markers. The effigy of Eleanor of Aquitaine in Fontevraud Abbey, France, shows her reclined, reading a book, a gesture suggesting her learning and piety. The effigy of Edward III in Westminster Abbey is a majestic representation of a powerful king. These tombs taught about the lineage of rulers, their piety, their power, and their contributions. For subsequent generations, visiting these tombs was a tangible connection to the past, a visual lesson in royal history and continuity. The wealth and artistry poured into these memorials underscored the importance of the individuals and their historical significance. Illuminated chronicles and historical manuscripts also served as educational tools for history, particularly for the elite and literate. Works like Matthew Paris's Chronica Majora, created in the 13th century, were lavishly illustrated with scenes from biblical history, Roman emperors, and contemporary events. These illustrations often depicted battles, coronations, diplomatic meetings, and significant discoveries. The visual narrative brought the historical accounts to life, making them more engaging and memorable. Painting of a crusade battle, for instance, conveyed the drama and heroism of the conflict. These manuscripts taught about the sweep of history, the lives of great figures, and the unfolding of events, reinforcing a particular historical understanding for those who could access them. They were history textbooks for a select audience, shaping their understanding of the world's past. Even civic art could be used to commemorate local history. In cities like Venice, Italy, frescoes and paintings in public buildings often depicted important battles won by the Republic, or significant ceremonies and events in the city's past. For instance, paintings in the Doge's palace in Venice commemorated naval victories or the swearing-in of new doges, the city's chief magistrates. These artworks instilled a sense of civic pride and collective memory. They taught citizens about the triumphs and achievements of their city, reinforcing their loyalty and identification with the Republic. These historical scenes served as constant reminders of the city's strength, independence, and glorious past, shaping a shared civic identity. Finally, family trees and lineage scrolls, often beautifully illuminated, traced the ancestry of noble families. These visual documents combined portraits, heraldic devices, and genealogical information, illustrating the intricate web of kinship and power. They taught about family connections, inheritance rights, and the long history of a particular noble house. For individuals within those families, these scrolls were a source of identity and pride, connecting them to a storied past. For those outside, they provided a visual map of the powerful families and their influence within society. These artistic, historical documents were vital for maintaining social order and power structures through the careful recording and display of lineage. Number 7. Moral and ethical guidance. For medieval people, a central function of art was to teach morality and proper ethical conduct. With widespread illiteracy, visual narratives were essential for communicating the principles of Christian doctrine, the consequences of sin, and the path to salvation. These artworks were not just inspiring, they were didactic, acting as sermons in stone, paint, or glass. They taught about the virtues to uphold, the vices to avoid, and the ultimate divine judgment that awaited everyone. The Last Judgment scene, often found on the tympanum above the main portal of major cathedrals, was one of the most powerful and direct forms of moral instruction. Cathedral of Saint-Lazare in Autun, France, created by the sculptor Gilbertus in the early 12th century, a monumental Last Judgment depicts Christ in majesty separating the saved from the damned. On one side, angels assist the righteous towards heaven, while on the other, demons drag the wicked into the gaping jaws of hell. Horrific torments are shown, reminding viewers of the consequences of sin. For a medieval person entering the church, this terrifying and glorious scene was an immediate and visceral lesson. It taught that every action had eternal consequences, that sin led to damnation, and that righteousness led to salvation. It was a constant public reminder to live a virtuous life. Allegories of virtues and vices were another common way. Art taught morality. The Psychomachia, an early Christian poem describing the battle between virtues and vices, was a popular theme. Artworks would depict personified virtues like prudence or charity, battling personified vices like avarice or envy. These scenes could be found in illuminated manuscripts, on carved capitals, in cloisters, or on the bases of sculptures. At Chartres Cathedral, for example, there are sculptural groups depicting virtues triumphing over vices, showing a graceful virtue standing on a defeated grotesque vice. These visual allegories taught people about the inner struggle between good and evil. They provided concrete images for abstract moral concepts, showing that virtues were powerful and vices were destructive. People learned to identify these qualities in themselves and others, and to strive for virtuous behavior. The 7 deadly sins and the 7 virtues were often depicted in contrasting pairs. A series of images might show pride leading to a fall, while humility led to grace. Each sin would be illustrated with a specific act or character, making its nature clear. For instance, gluttony might be shown as an overweight figure surrounded by food and drink, while temperance might be a balanced figure with a chalice. These visual lessons taught about specific moral pitfalls to avoid and the positive qualities to cultivate. They were practical guides for ethical living, making abstract moral principles accessible and understandable to everyone regardless of their literacy level. Scenes from the lives of saints also served as moral instruction, offering examples of virtuous living. A stained glass window depicting Saint Martin of Tours dividing his cloak with a beggar taught about charity and compassion. Painting of Saint Francis preaching to the birds taught about humility and care for creation. These narratives presented tangible models for ethical behavior. People learned that holiness was achievable through acts of kindness, self-sacrifice, and unwavering faith. The stories were inspiring, but also prescriptive, showing the specific actions that led to a virtuous life, and ultimately to sainthood. Even humorous or grotesque elements in art, like gargoyles or marginalia in manuscripts, sometimes conveyed moral lessons. A gargoyle with a hideous face might represent the ugliness of sin. A bizarre creature in the margin of a manuscript might illustrate the folly or absurdity of worldly pursuits. While seemingly light-hearted, these elements subtly reinforced the boundaries of acceptable behavior and belief. They taught that there were consequences for deviating from the righteous path, even if expressed through exaggerated or cautionary imagery. Through these diverse and pervasive artistic forms, medieval society instilled a clear understanding of right and wrong, guiding its members towards a morally upright existence. Number 8. Theological instruction and scripture for the illiterate. For most people in the Middle Ages, reading was not a common skill. The Bible, written primarily in Latin, was inaccessible to the vast majority. This presented a significant challenge for the Church, which needed to teach complex theological doctrines and biblical narratives to its flock. Art rose to this challenge, becoming the primary visual medium for conveying religious truths. These artworks were not just beautiful, they were vital teaching tools, acting as Bibles for the illiterate. They taught the core stories of salvation, the lives of Christ and the saints, and fundamental Christian concepts through images. Stained glass windows were arguably the most breathtaking and effective teachers of theological narratives. The sheer scale and vivid colors of these windows, especially in the great cathedrals of the High Middle Ages like Chartres, Bourges, or Canterbury, turned church interiors into luminous visual classrooms. A single window might depict an entire biblical cycle, from the story of Genesis to the life of Christ, or the events of the apocalypse. For instance, the Tree of Jesse window in Chartres Cathedral, dating from the 12th century, visually illustrates Christ's royal lineage stemming from Jesse, the father of King David. Each figure in the tree represents a biblical ancestor. People looking at this window learned about Christ's historical and prophetic roots. Another common theme was the Passion cycle, showing scenes of Christ's suffering, crucifixion, and resurrection, which were central to Christian belief. The windows provided a sequential narrative, allowing viewers to read the stories by moving their eyes from panel to panel. The light filtering through the colored glass added to the spiritual experience, making the theological lessons feel almost divine. Fresco paintings on church walls served a similar purpose, especially in areas where stained glass was less prevalent or feasible. In countless parish churches and monastic chapels across Europe, walls were covered with paintings depicting scenes from the Old and New Testaments, the lives of saints, or moral allegories. The frescoes in the Upper Basilica of St. Francis in Assisi, Italy, dating from the late 13th and early 14th centuries, are particularly famous for their vivid depiction of the life of St. Francis. These paintings, attributed to Giotto and his workshop, portray Francis's conversion, his preaching, his miracles, and his death. For the countless pilgrims visiting the basilica, these frescoes told the story of one of Christianity's most beloved saints, teaching them about humility, compassion, and devotion to God's creation. They communicated St. Francis's ideals and actions, inspiring similar piety in viewers. Illuminated manuscripts, while primarily for the literate elite or for clergy, also played a role in theological instruction, especially in picture Bibles or poor man's Bibles, which emphasized imagery over extensive text. These books contained numerous illustrations of biblical events, often arranged in parallel columns to show connections between Old Testament prophecies and New Testament fulfillment. Bible moralizy, for example, would pair an Old Testament scene with a corresponding New Testament scene, and then with a moral or theological interpretation, all visually. These books taught complex typological connections between the two testaments, showing how events in the Old Testament prefigured events in Christ's life. The visual links were explicit, making the theological concept of fulfillment clear without needing extensive textual explanation. Sculptural programs on cathedral portals and interiors also functioned as encyclopedias of theological knowledge. The vast sculptural narratives on the west facade of Notre Dame de Paris or the Royal Portal at Chartres present a visual summary of Christian theology. Figures of prophets and apostles, kings and queens, and scenes from the life of Mary and Christ all combine to tell a grand story. The placement of specific figures, like the wise and foolish virgins on the portal at Vézelay, taught about vigilance and readiness for Christ's return. The hierarchy of figures and their symbolic attributes conveyed theological truths about their roles in salvation history. For a medieval person entering a cathedral, the entire building was a sacred text, each stone figure and window panel contributing to a comprehensive visual education in Christian doctrine. Finally, specific devotional images such as crucifixes, Madonna, and child statues, or icons of saints, served as direct teaching tools about central theological figures and concepts. Crucifix prominently displayed in a church taught about Christ's sacrifice and redemption. A statue of the Madonna and Child taught about the Incarnation, God becoming human through Mary. These single images were powerful focal points for prayer and contemplation, but also for learning about the attributes and significance of divine figures. They provided tangible representations of abstract theological ideas, helping people connect emotionally and spiritually with the core tenets of their faith. Through these diverse and pervasive visual forms, medieval art ensured that Christian theology and scripture were accessible and understood by all, regardless of their ability to read words on a page.